In this video, we're going to cover Dreamcast emulation on the PC version of Retroarch. Dreamcast, my favorite Sega system. The one I actually owned first as far as Sega home consoles are concerned. I owned Game Gear first out of all Sega consoles, but yes, I have a lot of love for the Dreamcast, and I'm so happy that it has become such a well-emulated system, because original hardware will always succumb to some problems at some point, so I'm glad that I have a way of continuing its legacy. But Dreamcast emulation isn't super complicated these days, so let's go ahead and get it set up. So to get started with Dreamcast emulation on the PC version of Retroarch, you need to install the PC version of Retroarch, so you could do it through standalone or Steam versions. Doesn't really matter a whole lot. But if you don't have it installed already, just follow along with one of my Retroarch install guides. Links to these will be in the description below. Get Retroarch installed and configured to your liking, and then continue along with this tutorial. Again, links in the description below. Now, all you really need to emulate Dreamcast games are Dreamcast games. BIOS files are no longer necessary within the Flycast core on Retroarch, but if you want to include a BIOS file, you can grab one of those as well. It is optional. But Dreamcast games can be in a couple of different formats. There is the full game rip GDI format, CDI, or you can compress your GDI files into CHUD format, which is what I have done here. So that way these are the full game rips, but they aren't taking up 1.1 gigs of space. For anyone interested in converting their GDI games over to CHUD format, I will have a link to a program to do so in the description below as well. You just download it, extract it, put it in the folder with your GDI filed games, and then execute it. Now, as for acquiring Dreamcast games and BIOS files, if you happen to still own a physical Dreamcast, it's actually a pretty simple process to rip your own games and BIOS files using a system. It does require an SD card adapter, but those are relatively cheap, about $13. And this gives you unlimited access to your BIOS file and ripping your own Dreamcast games. Alternatively, just use Google and do things that way, but don't ask me for illegal download links because I will not provide them. Now, there is a little bit of extra setup involved for multi-disc Dreamcast games. Your single-disc games are going to be fine as is, but if you have multi-disc games like Resident Evil 2, for example, you are going to need to create an M3U file to get that game to show up as a single entry within Retroarch, and easily swap discs between them. So creating M3U files is pretty simple. Just create a text document, name it after the game. I already have one in here, so this is just going to be a demo. Open up the text document. And now that that text document is open, we just need to paste in the file name for both of our discs. So for me, disc 1 and disc 2 of Resident Evil 2. You also need to include the file extension. So if you can't see file extensions, go to Show and make sure file name extensions is checkmarked. But just grab Resident Evil Disc 1 here. So my games are in CHUD format, so I just need to copy in the entire CHUD disk file name. If your games are in CDI format, you'll copy the CDI format. If they're in GDI, you're going to copy the GDI file. And then once you have all the discs in, you just save the text document. And then we just need to rename the extension from .txt to .m3u. And when Windows gets mad at you, just click on yes. There we go. There is our working M3U file for Resident Evil 2. But I already have one, so we're just going to get rid of that. So just repeat that same process for all of your games. So I have one for Shenmue and Code Veronica. But once you have all of your game files ready to go, you could just store them anywhere you want on your computer. It doesn't matter where they go, you can navigate to them within Retroarch. But for my example purposes here, I have a games folder, so I'm just going to drag it in there. Now, for anyone interested in using a Dreamcast BIOS file, an official Dreamcast BIOS file, you just need to source it again, like I said earlier. Make sure it is named dc_boot.bin. And then we just need to add it to our Retroarch system folder in a DC subfolder. So open up your Retroarch folder wherever you installed Retroarch. Find the system folder. Make a new folder and name it DC. Open that up and then just drag the BIOS file right on in and you are good to go. And with all of that in place, we are ready to load into Retroarch and download the Flycast core. So from the main menu, go into the online updater, core downloader, and then you can press right or up on your keyboard to get to the Sega section. And we are looking for Sega Dreamcast / Naomi Flycast Core. And there we go. Once it is downloaded, you can just back out to the main menu and begin loading up Dreamcast content. So the first option of doing so is to go to load content, navigate to the directory where your games are stored, select a game, select a core, and it will run. I'm not personally fond of this method, so what I'd like to do instead is use the Retroarch desktop menu to create a games playlist. So you can open up the desktop menu on the main menu by going to show desktop menu or press F5 on your keyboard. Once the desktop menu is loaded, over on the left hand side you'll see the content browser. So we just need to come over here, right click, new playlist, type in Sega, space, Dreamcast, and press enter. And that'll give us a new Sega Dreamcast playlist entry complete with a console icon. Now over here in the main window, we are going to right click, add a folder, navigate to where you have your Dreamcast games stored on your computer, and then select the folder. Now for core, choose Flycast, and database, choose Sega Dreamcast, and then press OK, and your playlist will now be populated with all of your games. And this includes your multi-disc games, so if you created M3U files for your multi-disc games and you don't want them to show up multiple times, so for example my Code Veronica ones, so here's my M3U file and then here's my individual discs. Just right click on the entry and then just tell it to delete. That way your game only takes up one entry. And there we go. So from here, if you want to make the playlist be a little bit prettier, you can right click on the Dreamcast playlist entry and tell it to download all the thumbnails for this playlist. Now for this to work, your games do need to be named a specific way, and none of mine are, so they're all going to fail as you are seeing here. But essentially it is looking for the game name followed by a region code. So I'm going to just try this real quick and see if it works. And there we go. So game followed by region code, it was able to find the box art. So you could just go through and do this for any games that you want. But for any games that it is unable to find in its internal database just because of how you're naming them, you can manually add in box art if desired. So what I like to do in these instances is head over to GameFAQs, look up the game in question, head to their media section, boxes, and there is a nice selection of every box art for the game. So I'm looking for the US Dreamcast release. I'm just going to save this image to my desktop. There we go. Just move Retroarch out of my way here for a second. And so there's my box art. Unfortunately, they are not usable by default in JPEG format. Retroarch is looking for PNG format files. So if you need to convert, just open up Paint, drag your box art in, and then just save it as a PNG format picture. You don't even need to rename it. There we go. Now back in the desktop menu, make sure the game in question is selected, and then just drag the box art right into the box art preview screen there, and it applies it to the game. So there we go. Now Code Veronica has a box art. So you could go through and pretty up your playlist as much as you want, but I'm going to call it there for my demonstration purposes. Now one last thing to note about the desktop menu and one of the cool features of it. Over on the right hand side, it shows you if it is able to see all the firmware needed for different types of emulation. So if you added in a Dreamcast BIOS like I did, it should be showing up green as present. If you are hoping to do Naomi emulation, you need to add in all these Naomi BIOS files into that same DC subfolder like we did the Dreamcast BIOS. I'm not covering Naomi and Atomic Wave emulation specifically for this video, but if you have those BIOS files, they go in that DC folder, and then your Naomi and Atomic Wave games should boot. But anyway, once you're done, close out of the desktop menu, press F on Retroarch to make it full screen again, and to get our new playlist to show up on the left here, just click on the Restart Retroarch button. And now we have a new Dreamcast entry list here on the left, with all of our games listed here, and if there were thumbnails added in, you'll see them over on the right, so very cool stuff. But to play a game, all you need to do is select it and tell it to run. And I love that it's in Japanese by default whenever I use this BIOS file that I ripped from my English system. It makes total sense. But, there we go. But there we go, Dreamcast emulation up and running on the PC version of Retroarch. So you can enjoy an overwhelming majority of your Dreamcast library just from doing those initial steps. And again, you don't even need to have a BIOS file. But this being emulation, there is so much more that we can do with it. So from this point on in the video, we're going to be covering advanced emulation options available to us with the Flycast core. So to access the Retroarch quick menu, just press F1 on your keyboard or a guide button on a controller. And this brings us into the quick menu, so scroll down until you find the core options. So our first set of options are within the system tab here. And our first option is region select. So default should work for most use cases, but when it doesn't, as you can see with my crazy taxi here, a lot of it's in Japanese. That's not correct. I'm just going to manually set this to USA. And then the next option is language, and I'm going to set this to English, so that way I don't have to be worried about Japanese text anymore. Our next option is to use the HLE BIOS file if we do have an actual BIOS file present, so you can force the use of a high-level emulation BIOS file. Not really sure why you would want to when you have an actual Dreamcast BIOS file present, but the option's there for you. Next, we have the option to boot directly into the Dreamcast BIOS file. So if you ever want to boot into the Dreamcast BIOS, if you happen to have one inside your Retroarch system folder, you enable this option, close out of your current content, tell it to run again, and when your content loads, you'll be in the Dreamcast BIOS menu, and you can change different settings and things like that, as well as manage memory cards, so you can see your VMU saves. And when you're done in this menu, just press F1 on your keyboard again to go back into the quick menu, go into core options, and disable the option to boot to BIOS. And then you can just restart it to get back into your original game. And hey, look at that, it's all in English now. Great. Our next option is to enable sound, so leave this one on if you want your games to have sound. Next, force Windows CE mode. This is more useful for different types of homebrew applications that might not enter Windows CE mode automatically. And then last up, we have set Naomi games to free play, so you don't have to insert coins to play them. Again, I'm not covering Naomi games specifically, but I'd suggest leaving this option on. Alright, backing out and heading into the video tab. Our first option is internal resolution, so Dreamcast games don't seem to take much of a hit as you upscale them, so full 4K should be achievable for most of you out there, as long as you have a decent emulation computer. Next up is cable type, so this is set to just your normal composite cable by default, and that works in most use cases. Do know that there are some games that will not work unless you set this to RGB or VGA, and the reverse is also true. If you have this set to VGA, a lot of games might not work until you set it back to composite. So for most use cases, just leave this on composite, and if you find a game that doesn't work, try one of the other options, because it's a bit more work to set it to VGA and find out which ones will not work. It's more of a hassle kind of deal thing here, but do it however you see fit. Next up, broadcast standard, so you can change this between NTSC and PAL. Screen orientation, so this will let you flip the screen vertically if you have tape mode games, and you want to play them vertically. Next up, alpha sorting. This is set to per triangle by default, and this is going to be your most compatible and accurate option. If you have a faster CPU, you can set this to per pixel, which will be a lot more accurate, so you won't have layering issues with certain things. Or if you have a slower computer, you can set it to per strip, so it's going to be a lot less accurate, but a lot faster. So on my machine, I can do per pixel and be just fine. Next up, accumulation pixel buffer size. So this is set to 512 megabytes by default, but if you're upscaling, you might want to increase this up to higher values. Next up, maximum transparent layers. This is set to 32 by default, but again, if you have a more powerful computer, you can increase it to get better accuracy. Next, render to texture buffer. I like to turn this option on personally. MIP mapping, leave this one on. Fog effects, leave it on. Volume modifier, leave it on. And now anisotropic filtering, this is set to 4 by default, but if you want to smooth out your textures a bit more from different angles, you can increase it up to 16. Next, texture filtering, so set to default by default, but you can force a nearest neighbor texture scaling method or a linear texture scaling method. So nearest neighbor is going to be a bit more sharp and pixelated, whereas linear is going to be slightly more blurred. Next up, delay frame swapping. So if you are on a faster computer, enable this option. It could help with some flickering videos. Next, detect frame rate changes. So this could be useful for games that have locked frame rates around the 30 or 20 FPS mark. But if your game has an unlocked frame rate, it's not recommended to use it. So you can read the description underneath it there to get some game examples. But I don't typically tend to use this setting personally, so you could try it out for yourself in your lower frame rate games, see what you think. Next up, PowerVR 2 post-processing filter. I like to turn this one on, makes it a bit more accurate to an original Dreamcast video output. Next up, texture upscaling using the XBRZ method. So if you are playing 2D Dreamcast games and want to just up-res them a bit more, you could enable this option and choose between 2, 4, or 6x upscaling. And then you can choose the texture upscaling max filtered size. And our last option is native depth interpolation. So if you are on an AMD GPU, turn this option on. It could also be useful for Intel integrated GPUs. If you're on NVIDIA, should not be needed. Alright, backing out and moving on, performance tab. So the only option we're really interested in here is threaded rendering, and it's already turned on, so yay. If you are on a really low-end CPU, though, you might want to turn on auto frame skip. But as for normal frame skipping, just no. Alright, next up, emulation hacks. So our first option in here is for widescreen cheats. The Flycast core already has a number of built-in widescreen cheats, so you don't have to go in and manually apply anything. You just enable the option, and if there is a widescreen cheat inside the core for the game in question, it will automatically be applied. And this does require a content restart to take effect. So you can just close out of it, and then tell it to run again. And so there we go, Crazy Taxi running in widescreen using the built-in widescreen cheats. So personal preference on if you want to use it or not. And next we have a widescreen hack. So for any games that don't have a built-in widescreen cheat, you can try to enable this to stretch it or force it into a 16:9 aspect ratio. Chances are it will result in some severe pop-in on the 4:3 borders, but you could give it a try on your games to see what happens. Next up, GD-ROM fast loading. So you could turn this on to increase loading speeds. Might cause an issue here or there with some games, but can increase loading speeds, so personal preference on if you want to use that or not. And finally, we have loading custom textures. So if you want to use HD texture packs, turn this option on. And then just go ahead and close out of your currently running Dreamcast game. And then I'm just going to close out a Retroarch. So the first step to getting an HD texture pack working on Flycast is to find an HD texture pack for Flycast. There's a few on Reddit, you can find others on Google. Like, there's no real centralized location for it that I've found, unfortunately. But I'm just going to grab one for Crazy Taxi. So I'm just going to click on the download link and get it downloaded. And with that HD texture pack downloaded, I'm just going to get it extracted now. There we go. So it comes in a folder named MK-51035 for Crazy Taxi, and I'm going to leave it in that folder. So now I just need to put this into my RetroArch system folder in that DC subfolder that we created earlier. If you did, it should automatically be created if you've been running Dreamcast games as well. But go to System, open up the DC folder, create a new folder in here, and name it Textures. And then just drag your HD texture packs on in. Now we could go ahead and launch back into Crazy Taxi here and showcase the changed HD texture pack effect. And there we go, Crazy Taxi running with an HD texture pack. So you can see on the road, and the bricks here in particular are quite different than their standard selves. But if you want to create your own HD texture packs for Dreamcast games, you can come back into the Emulation Hacks tab, turn on Dump Textures, and it will dump every texture that you see in the game you are currently playing into a different folder in that DC folder that you can then go and edit into an HD texture pack. But moving on, next up, input. So our first set of options are to change dead zone percentages on our controllers. So you can change your analog stick dead zones, your trigger dead zones. You can enable digital triggers if you don't want to have dead zone percentages or analog stick ranges. Good for fighting games. Next, vibration packs, the pack. So if you don't want to have rumble, you can turn this option off. We're going to skip over broadcast digital outputs and move on to gun crosshairs. So if you're playing light gun games, you can enable crosshairs for your light guns and choose between 4 different colors. And you can do that on all 4 player ports. Alright. Last up, visual memory unit. So the first option is per game VMUs. So I recommend turning this option on for at least a VMU A1, so that way you never have to worry about running out of save space. But you can still share saves between different memory cards for different games with the other 3 ports. Next, we could display our VMU on screen. So you can see it up in the upper left-hand side of my screen now. And you can choose the screen position for it, as well as the size. I like to make this one at least 2x, so it's actually displayable up there. Then you can choose the colors, as well as the opacity. So right now, it is not transparent at all. So if we knock this down to about 50%, we could still see the game underneath it, as well as the VMU screen, so that way it doesn't really affect as much as it does when it's just completely opaque. And then the same options for VMU 2 through 4. And there we go. And with that, we have covered all of the available core options to us within Flycast. So as always, if there are options you want to save for some games but not others, you can head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file, so that way they don't interfere with other games that you might be running. Useful for that cable type to run Unreal Tournament. You need to set it to VG or RGB for Unreal Tournament to run, so you can set it to RGB, save it as a game override. But now let's talk about controls. So if you head into the controls tab, head down to port 1, 2, 3, or 4 controls, you can see that you could change your device type from a number of different controller options. You could set it to arcade sticks, keyboard or mouse. So if you want to play keyboard or mouse, light guns, twin sticks, a Saturn twin stick, you set those options here. So for anyone interested in running mouse and keyboard on games like Quake 3, the controllers need to be set to port 1 being keyboard, port 2 being mouse, for this game in particular at least. Then you go up to Manage Remap Files, save them as a game remap, and then just restart the game for them to actually take effect. I didn't restart the game before, so that's why my keyboard was just not registering, but now it works perfectly. So now I can just press scroll lock. So now I can just press scroll lock to enable game focus mode, and I can begin mapping my controls. So as you can see, my keyboard is working. And one more thing to cover here is disc changing for multi-disc games. So I've loaded up Shenmue here to be my example game. So if I press start, go to new game, it tells me that the game can only be started from disc 1. So to open up and swap out disc 1. So press F1 on your keyboard to go to the Retroarch quick menu. Inside the quick menu, scroll down to disc control. Press Enter or A on a controller to eject the disc, and you'll see a new option called Current Disk Index. So if you press A on this or Enter on this, you'll see all the discs that you listed inside your M3U file when you created it during game setup. So we just need to switch over to disk 1 and insert the disc. Now, chances are, by default, it might not register the disk swap, and this is because of a setting within Retroarch that pauses the game while the quick menu is open. So if this happens to you, you can just back out to the main menu of Retroarch here, go to Settings, go to User Interface, scroll down to Pause Content when menu is active, and turn this option off. And then in your main menu, go back into your quick menu, head down to Overrides, and save Core Overrides so that way that option will not take effect for your Dreamcast game emulation. or you could save it as a game override, so that way it only pauses during multi-disc games. But resume our content, go back in just to make sure, but disk control, eject disk, boots us back to the Dreamcast BIOS screen. We're going to change to Shenmue Disk 1, insert the disk, and tell it to play. And now we can start a game as intended. Now, one of the last options I want to cover here real quick is shaders. Shaders within RetroArch are quite extensive. There's a number of great options available, but going into the RetroArch quick menu, scroll down to the shaders tab, and you can enable them if they aren't already. And then make sure you've downloaded shaders from the online updater during your initial RetroArch setup. But click on load, shader slang, and you can apply any number of shaders. There's no such thing as the best shader. It's all personal preference, so just use one that you enjoy. So for me personally, I like to go with CRT Easy Mode because I think it gives a nice appearance in upscaled and native resolution content, and it just gives me some nice grid lines and effects, and I really enjoy it. Like, it looks good to me. It doesn't require a crap ton of setup, so it's just nice, easy mode. Like, there we go. So go through shaders, find which ones you enjoy for your games, the look that it gives you, and just things like that. Again, all personal preference. But once you do find a shader that you like, just go back into your quick menu, go into the shaders tab, click on save, and then you can save them as a core preset, so that way every time you load up a game, that is the shader that will greet you. And that's going to do it for Dreamcast emulation in the Flycast core of RetroArch. Overall, Flycast is a great core for Dreamcast gaming. You might encounter the occasional visual glitch here and there still, but overall you should be able to enjoy an overwhelming majority of your Dreamcast library. But thank you so much for watching today's tutorial. I hope you have found it informative and it helps you get your Dreamcast emulation projects running to your liking. But here at the end, I do have a couple of big favors to ask. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit that like, dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's tutorial, as well as that sub button and notification bell so you can see when new videos go live on the channel. I always have new content coming your way, so I want to have each and every one of you along for the ride. For anyone interested in further helping support the channel, you can also check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little goes a long way to helping us keep this place going and bringing this content directly to you. Big shout out to all of our current backers. Y'all are amazing. Thank you so much for believing in what we do here and helping us keep it going. Y'all are the truest of champs. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we'll see you back next video.